Alistair, it's a joy to be able to have you here for, well, our first virtual meeting. Many of us, I think, will remember the seminar that, how long ago did you work out it was?
I think it was about 2015.
Right. So, God, I don't know where time goes. And many of us valued that seminar. And so I'm really thrilled that you're able to come and share some of the work that you've done since then, whet our appetites with this, and maybe prepare us for your next book. So in just a moment, I've asked Barbara if she will open with prayer. And once she's done that, we're in your hands. So, Barbara, would you open with prayer?
Yep. God of care and compassion, in this Easter season, we ask you to draw close to us as we look to understand better your resurrection message, that you are with us in sorrow and in joy, at our beginning and at our end. We give you thanks for Alistair, for the gifts you give him, and for this opportunity to bring to you our griefs and our losses, no matter how big, no matter how trivial. May our hearts and minds be open to hear you speaking to us, so that we in turn may have the grace to lighten the burdens of grief with our brothers and sisters. Bless us, we pray, and pour your peace on our gathering, that we may find here comfort, strength, and refreshment for your love's sake. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Alistair.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. This is actually the third time that I've done something with your diocese. The first time was in 2011, when I was the guest speaker at a ministry school. I recall that was in payment when Alec was ministry educator, and he had preached at our wedding. And I think that was the payback I had to give. And then I came back in 2015 after I published my first book. And that's how I met several of you then. What I'm going to do is share a screen with you. I will be wanting to cover a fair bit tonight. And because I'm so passionate about the subject, if I don't have notes in front of me, I'll get sidetracked. So if you see me looking to my side, it's because I'm following some notes. It's not because I'm distracted with you. If you could just bear with me for a moment, I'm going to attempt sharing the screen. And if I can do this without calling in the ministry educator from Waiapu, I will be extremely pleased with myself. I want to pick up with you some ideas tonight, really that I draw on in my last book, The Grief Walk, of exploring our experiences of loss and grief. Just a little bit of history for those who don't know it. That book came out last year, and it was a result of this earlier book that some of you know, Earthed in Hope, which I'd really written focusing on funeral ministry and was written for practitioners. But I was very surprised by the number of people who actually picked up and read it from public libraries or church libraries. So I decided I wanted to write something else that was specifically about grief and that was geared towards people in the pew on Sunday morning. And I've found that, in fact, it's gone to an even wider audience. In any group I'm working with, and if we were physically together, I'd still go through this, but I think this is just as important because we will share some things together this evening, is just to outline some norms which I think will be self-explanatory, but they're good that we identify them. And as I think about them, they're also good norms for us to work with and to bear in mind when we're journeying with others in grief or any pastoral situation. The comment attributed to Paul Tillich, the first duty of love is to listen. We listen to each other with care and respect and attention. And I'm suggesting these norms because what I want to offer tonight is not an academic exercise, but a personal exploration. So that listening is incredibly important. Let's use also I statements. I understand, I experience, it's like this for me. One thing that I will stress throughout the evening is that grief is an utterly unique experience. So it's important we don't allow ourselves to slip into generalizations. We speak from our experience. The third thing is we aren't talking about something abstract. It is grief, first and foremost, the cry of a wounded and broken heart. And it's a good thing to assume that everyone in this meeting tonight is grieving in one way or another, to some extent or another. And of course, we respect the privacy of the others, acknowledging that this has been recorded. We say as much or as little about our experiences we choose. And fifthly, the obvious statement, you all know it, we keep confidentiality. Well, my opening statement really is, we all lose and we all grieve far more than we probably realize. Our lives are loaded with loss and grief. Loss is an integral part of our life. A writer who has influenced me very substantially is the Christian philosopher and theologian Nicholas Wolterstorff. Nicholas's 24-year-old son, Eric, died in a mountain climbing accident. And he wrote a very powerful little book called Lament for a Son. And in the Grief Walk, I draw unapologetically on Wolterstorff's writing. And he offers what I consider one of the most helpful definitions of grief. It's not a technical definition, and it takes us to what I call the sting of grief. It is the neverness that is so painful. Never again to be here with us, never to sit with us at table, never to travel with us, never to laugh with us, never to cry with us, never to embrace us as he leaves for school, never to see his brothers and sisters marry. All the rest of our lives we must live without him. Only our death can stop the pain of his death. The physical death of a loved one is probably the toughest loss that most of us face. It's what we call bereavement. And it's what we generally associate grief with. But I want you just to consider the following phrases, please. We're moving. I'm leaving you. We don't need you anymore. It's time to retire. This parish is no longer viable. It will be closed. Your building is an earthquake risk. It's a disability and you're going to have to learn to live with it. I recommend you put your pet down. I can't trust you anymore. I miscarried. It's not possible for you to have birth children. You see, common to all those statements is the experience of neverness. Never again. Life as it was no longer exists. And we've got to somehow come to terms with this new reality. So I give you a question to ponder, and I invite you just to be still with it for a moment. And if you've got a pen and paper on your desk, you might want to jot down. As you reflect on your experience, what comes to mind when you hear those words, never again, neverness? In other words, I'm asking you, what losses do you identify? And as they come to your mind, don't analyze them or judge them. Simply take a moment with yourself to name them. So I'm just going to invite us just to be still for just a couple of minutes with that question. I suspect some things have come to your mind immediately. And I invite you, if you'd like, without going into any detail, just to, if you wish, unmute yourself and just name them, but don't go into any detail. But what come to your mind? Go for it.
The changes associated with COVID,
Yeah.
different patterns in just about everything.
Yeah, yeah. The changes of pattern. Mm. 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 One of the things about change, whether it's we perceive it as a good one or an unhelpful one, whether we've initiated or not, there's often grief associated. Anything else there?
Also thinking about when you've had the luxury of your children living in the same city, it's a huge move when they move away, or a huge change when they move away.
It's a very big one. Yes. And as one parent at our parish school said the other day, she said, I didn't know how much I'd actually grieve when my child started school because my whole life had changed. I had an interesting one the other day that came up at the gym. I used to powerlift, and the deadlift was my favorite lift. And I had diagnosed about a year and a half ago, a condition in my spine, which means I can't deadlift anymore. And the guy at the gym said the other day, a young man said, I noticed you don't deadlift anymore. What happened? And I explained to him. And he said, that was your best lift. I said, yeah, I was sitting on 147.5 kilograms. And I was waiting for that final lift of 150, which I'll never make now. And he said, what's that like? And I said, it's a loss. And the young man got it. You're hearing what I'm saying? You see, what we're naming, what I'm naming here, are what we often call disenfranchised losses and griefs. These are losses and griefs that aren't recognized as such. And They're not openly acknowledged. And that creates for us a paradox. We experience a loss, but we don't believe we have the right to grieve that loss. Just to flesh out that idea of disenfranchisement, it occurs for various reasons. The loss isn't socially validated. Here's a story from the grief walk. In the space of a year, Andrea experienced a miscarriage and a divorce. No one said to me, she said, you aren't allowed to grieve these losses, but their actions and words showed that I should keep my grief to myself. I was subtly and not so subtly told that I had to move on. So I learned that when asked how I was, I reply, fine, thanks. That's what people expected of me, and I came to expect it of myself. But I couldn't move on. I ended stuck in a loop, wondering why I couldn't escape, why my grief was all consuming. The relationship is either not appreciated or it's misunderstood. Our society sets what are called often grieving rules, and these have even been codified in legislation in terms of bereavement leave. You're granted 3 days if the person who died is from your immediate family. 1 day may be granted if the person is connected to you outside that definition. And it's only just recently that a miscarriage has been recognized under law as a bereavement. And I think, if I remember correctly, only came to law last year, if I'm correct on that one. So those societal or cultural rules, including religious ones, exclude not only losses that don't involve the death of an immediate family member, but disregard bereavement because our relationship with the person who has died isn't recognized. For example, and this is one that those of you who take funerals will encounter often, a former partner or spouse, a work colleague, an online friend, and that's an increasing dynamic these days, a same-gender partner or spouse, still, and certainly especially in some religious environments, is not recognized. A friend, a neighbor, acquaintance, a sibling. I learned that one very early on in my ministry, but often adult siblings get forgotten. A distant relation, a foster parent or child, a stepchild or parent, a partner of an extramarital relationship, caregivers, nurses. Those of you who have worked in rest homes will know how often caregivers and staff in rest homes carry very deep grief. I had a conversation with someone only today about that. And they've now got into the thing of ringing Alistair and talking about it. And often they will start talking about the person who's died in the rest home, but actually who they want and need to talk about is themselves, because that's a grief that's so often been forgotten. And of course, other professionals, counsellors, clergy. To those of you who are clergy people, do you give yourself the space to grieve? You know, a spiritual parishioner dies, someone who you've been very close to. I just leave the question hanging in the air. The way a person dies may be deemed not worthy of grief. This can include suicide, drug overdose, death resulting from a criminal activity. It can leave us feeling that we should hide our grief. The way we grieve isn't affirmed, such as the absence of outward expression of grief. Or on the other hand, the expression of grief may be considered OTT. You get it in statements like, you should be over it by now. Is this familiar?
Yeah.
It's time to move on. It's not as if she is your wife well, you only saw him occasionally. They're all disenfranchising statements about the grief. The person grieving isn't capable of grieving, and still, you may be surprised, but this is often still encountered. Both the very old and very young are often seen by others as having little comprehension of or reaction to the death of a significant person in their lives. Similarly, mentally disabled persons may also be disenfranchised in grief. And then the last one at the bottom of that list, and I have a sneaky feeling it may be, well, I'll make this very clearly an I statement. In my experience, is probably the most powerful act of disenfranchisement, and that's we disenfranchise ourselves because we don't acknowledge our grief or believe we shouldn't be grieving. Give you an example. I feel so embarrassed over my grief at the death of my pet. I shouldn't be feeling like this. People have been through far worse than me. Is this ringing any bells, people? Here's another story. It's again from the grief walk. David had just been made redundant. He worked for the company for over 30 years, and because of his age, he knew he would struggle to get another position. As he expressed his hurt and fears, tears came to his eyes, and then he suddenly stopped. But what I'm going through is nothing. I mustn't complain. One of my mates has got cancer. I've got to stop feeling sorry for myself. My loss is nothing compared to what my mate is facing. Self-disenfranchisement. The point is, David's loss does matter. It is something. Every loss hurts in its own unique way. The loss that matters is the one we're dealing with right now. Please never compare one grief with another. So here's a question, and you might again want to think about it and just demute if you want to make a comment on this one. I'm wondering how it was for you when you have experienced a loss or a grief that hasn't been acknowledged. Any comment there? What did it feel like?
Pretty stink.
Hmm?
Pretty stink.
Pretty stink, yeah. What made it stink?
The mere fact that when it hadn't been acknowledged, when my father died,
Yeah.
I came back to school after having taken his funeral and been with family and taken his funeral.
Yeah.
And staff didn't know where I was, where I'd been, and they, And then I said, "Oh, my father died. Were you not told about that?" So that was pretty stink.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. My experience is a matter of actually being able to own it and to say, yeah, it is stink. It does hurt. Thank you. One of the things that I think a lot of people talk about in the experience of grief is how it can be isolating. And disenfranchisement accentuates the sense of isolation because we think all our responses are wrong and inappropriate. So we feel unable to talk about it, unable to express it, unable to go and seek support. And we end up bearing our grief in silence. And the silence compounds the grief. And because we often grieve in silence, we don't recognize that we're actually grieving. We don't understand the true cause of the reactions. And we think we're being silly or oversensitive, or perhaps attributing our reaction to some other cause. You may have read in my biography, I've done a lot of transitional work, and I would move from parish to parish. And they were welcome moves, they were creative moves. I remember one day my wife saying, do you realize for about the first month after you leave the parish, you're quite grumpy? And it's all I needed for her to point that out, because I suddenly realized, even though it was a creative change, I was losing a whole lot of things. Familiarity, the community. I've only been there 6 months. I could have been there for a year. But each time there was a grief experience that I was going through. Mm. And it wasn't just about me being moody or grumpy. It was an experience of loss each time. And once I acknowledged that, I became very intentional about how I responded to it. So each time I would spend very specific time with my supervisor, reflecting on that experience. Going back to another writer, who some of you will know, who wrote a book parallel to Wolterstorff's one, Grief Observed. And I think the two stand side by side in their worth. But C.S. Lewis, an odd product of my loss is that I'm aware of being an embarrassment to everyone I meet. I see people as they approach me, trying to make up their minds whether they'll say something about it or not. Perhaps the bereaved ought to be isolated in special settlements like lepers. To some, I am worse than an embarrassment. I am death's head. Whenever I meet a happily married pair, I can feel them both thinking, one or other of us must someday be as he is now. Of course, reflecting on his bereavement following his wife's death. Does the image of the leper ring a bell with any of you? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. Yeah. Mm. It comes out in blatant ways. The number of people who have actually told me this very specific example, that following a bereavement, of walking down the supermarket aisle, seeing an acquaintance or a friend walking towards them, and the friend turning around and going down the next aisle.
Can I interrupt, Alistair?
Of course you may.
It doesn't have to be a bereavement. I had exactly that experience when I was diagnosed with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
The people that I thought were my friends, some of them could not cope. And I've seen friends duck around the next aisle rather than come face to face with cancer.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Mm.
And I think people have talked to me about the same experience of when a relationship or marriage ends. You're going through profound grief, but it's often not recognized, and people don't acknowledge it. So that sense of the leper of being in some form of social isolation, as Barbara says, is quite powerful. I think we often back off. Thank you, Barbara. We back off from grief because it awakens, I think, in us, our own vulnerability. It reminds us that one day, as Lewis says, one day this could be me. And because we've hidden grief away, we don't talk about it, we don't know how to talk about it, a gulf sort of emerges between those who are experiencing loss and those on the edge of their lives. And isolation also occurs because of the uniqueness of our grief. No one else can know how we feel. And when they say they do, we know in ourselves they don't know. Please don't say to someone else who's grieving, I know how you feel, because we don't know. We experience grief in such different ways. And even when we share the same loss with others, we're still alone because our grief has its own character. You experience this in a family. A parent dies, and each child, they share the same loss, but you've recognized how each member of the family grieves in quite different ways. It's why, clergy taking funerals, the funeral preparation, how often those interesting dynamics occur. And you see the tensions, and often what you're seeing is the very contrasting expressions of grief. The other thing I'd say is our loss dominates everything, but for those about us, our loss is an event that's come and it's gone. They go on with their daily lives while we're still trying to come to terms with it, and our lives have been thrown into chaos. People coming across someone who's grieving sometimes act as if nothing's happened. And it's not because they're uncaring, but because they don't know what to say, or they're afraid of causing more pain by mentioning the death or the loss. And I think Barbara illustrated that. By ignoring the grief and pretending the loss has never happened, of course, that simply accentuates the isolation. And the one thing that's often needed in grief is communication and connection. So I would encourage us to refer to the loss or the grief. Don't be afraid. You won't add to the hurt, because when we're grieving, we live with that painful reality every day. Failure to recognize the loss and to acknowledge the grief implies that it's something that's not significant, something that's shameful, rather than a natural and right thing for us to be experiencing. It denies the grieving person the opportunity to share their grief and suggests that it should be hidden away. And of course, that again is simply adding to the pain. So let's do some thinking about what grief might be like. The grief is unique. So please, would you forget the rules? None of us grieve the same way. Our grief is like our fingerprint. It's unique to us alone. Here's a quote from a parishioner. Her husband had died, and this was about 3-4 months down the track. I'm fed up with well-meaning friends who tell me what stage I'm at in my grief. They don't know what it's like to be me. They haven't a bloody clue what I'm going through. End of quote. Am I ringing bells here? Loss is universal. The grief experience isn't. It's like the fingerprint. It's unique to us alone. There isn't a right or wrong way to generally grieve. It's unpredictable, it's complex, it's messy. No two people will grieve in the same way. And our way of grieving is influenced by so many different factors. For example, our past experiences of loss and grief, how others in our family have modeled grief to us, our personality, introverts, extroverts, and all that sort of stuff, our cultural background, our age. How I grieve at 69 is probably quite different from how I grieved at 29. where we are in terms of self-awareness, our beliefs, the support and understanding we have from others, and of course, the significance and the context of the loss and the changes that that loss will bring to our lives. Now, of course, while there is no right way to grieve, there are, of course, common patterns. But how you experience them and choose to respond to them is unique. You may, example, not cry at all, or you may cry a lot. Some people find the intensity of grief lasts a long time, while others it lasts for less time. A way that I found helpful for understanding it and enriched it for me is this work by Ken Doka. If you come across any of his work, I found it very helpful, and Terry Martin. The first one was the heart or intuitive pattern. And you tend to express and cope with it emotionally. You experience your grief in waves of different emotions, have strong feelings of grief. It will be important for you to explore, express, share your emotions. And especially early on, following your loss, you may find these emotions are so strong they inhibit your ability to focus or to think straight. Your expression of grief will mirror what you're feeling inside, and you may find it helpful to have a safe place such as a support group or a trusted companion where you can express your feelings. So that's one primary way you may express it. Another way is what they call the head or instrumental pattern. And here the tendency is to adapt your grief in a more cognitive and physical and active ways. Do more thinking about your grief than feeling. You experience your grief as thoughts, such as flooding memories. You tend to express your grief in physical ways, and you'll want to do and to be active. You have a burial. One thing I've learned is you're doing a burial of someone. Get the undertaker. They like to call themselves funeral directors. I call them undertakers. Make sure they've got some shovels there, and make sure if family members want to fill the grave in, they get the chance. Because that very physical action for some people, and don't stereotype to males, please, that action of filling in the grave will be an incredibly powerful expression of their grief. If I'm going through tough stuff, I go down to the gym. It's through my bodily actions that I often express my deep emotions. It's about that needing to do things, to do something in response to your loss. And then, how I suspect it might be true for many of us, we operate with a blend of the two. You know, we fall somewhere along the continuum between the heart and the head, the intuitive and the instrumental. It means we borrow coping tools from both ends of the spectrum. So, here's another question for you. Just again, take a moment, or you might jot it down and think about it for yourself later on. How would you describe the way you grieve? And you may notice that the way you grieve at various times in your life changes, or how you grieve over various losses is different. And in asking yourself that question, please remember there isn't a right or wrong answer to this one. Just wondering if there are any immediate responses to that question. I'm just hanging in the air there for you. Take a moment to think about it.
I would say, for me, watching a movie. because it allows me to cry without saying why.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Mm. Mm.
As you raised the question, I think a couple popped into my head, and I think what I was unaware that was attached to the grief affected how I grieved. So if I thought something was unjust or there was a bit of anger and annoyance, the gym was a very good one for me because it was channeled in a way that you could bench more than was physically comfortable because you are straining and you're stressing intentionally.
Yep.
When there are those losses that you're lost for words, watching the mighty Clutha River just trickle by and staring for in those moments. So whatever I was holding on to seemed to bear out in the grief. If it was anger, physicalness really helped, pushing beyond a limit or a comfortable limit. It was a horrible loss where the words were, God, how could you, or something like that.
Yeah.
Silence. And to be how I think I'm grieving.
Yeah. Thank you. There's some real wisdom there. Well, love, thank you for sharing that. The contrast between watching the movie and watching the mighty river.
Yeah.
But what a rich contrast. And yet both right. For you. Thank you. In a second, I think we've been operating for 3 quarters now. We'll go and just leg stretch. But here's quite a profound and psychologically insightful post. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. And I encourage you to lay aside, to forget stages in grief. Stages in grief. This was, of course, made popular in the late 70s, mid-70s by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's what we often call the psychological model of grief. And it goes like this. Loss occurs, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It's the straight line. It's a very neat and tidy process. And this was very readily accepted as the normal way to grieve. And it was assumed that if we grieve well, then we ought to pass through these 5 stages in that order. If a person doesn't, then they aren't grieving correctly. My experience that grief is actually no straight line. It's messy. That's the reality. And I think we often get attracted to the stage model because grief is a chaotic experience. And it gives us a sense of order and control in a time of immense disorder and disempowerment. Now, the dangers of propagating the grief stage model is that we ought to grieve in a certain way adds the burden that grieving people are actually carrying. And it can invoke a sense of guilt, leading to think they aren't grieving properly. I remember many years ago, a young man coming to me whose father had died, and he said, Alistair, I'm grieving all wrong. I read this book and it told me I should be feeling angry by now. I don't feel any anger. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Can you show me the right way to grieve? And it's why I get very nervous with a series of books that imply this is how you should grieve. The little book he was referring to is still being published by Westberg called Good Grief. And I actually think it's a potentially quite a dangerous book because while Westberg, in fact, qualifies and says you don't necessarily go through that, the way it's set out is these are the stages that are normal. It can be used as a checklist. I've done the denial, tick that off, now the anger, been the bargaining, been there, done that. Grief can be a journey that takes a lifetime. We may experience one or more of those reactions described by the model as stages. We may experience them in order, we may experience them in a different order, we may experience them concurrently, we may not. We may revisit them. But I think most disquieting about the stage model is that they lead those around the grieving person to think they know what the person's going through, and they can tell the person what to expect next, like that parishioner who had the rant at me after church one day. I'm not even personally prepared to talk about grief as a process, because to me that sounds too glib, because it suggests that grief is something we do that's got a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end. Here's a different way of seeing it. I'm not saying this is the right way, it's just another way of a spiral in which we may experience or view these feelings and reactions many times, but each time from a different angle or level. Question, because you will still encounter it, and I'm making a point of it because in some areas it is still being taught, the stage model. Any comments or reactions to it, please? Just briefly.
I'm actually surprised how prevalent the idea of the stage model is. So many people have heard of it and do take this view that this is how you do it,
Right,
for themselves and for others.
Yep.
And I found an oscillating theory can be very helpful for folk who've seen that. And you can put lots of feelings in one, the feelings of downcast, confusion, and then more hopeful feelings, and recognizing that you've got these two sort of oval shapes, and then recognizing the wobble from one to the other. Some days are better than others. And I found a lot of people have found that idea of wobbling around, and sometimes eventually, but the hope comes in, where you might spend more time in the more hopeful lot eventually.
Yeah. That's my point. What I call we wax and we wane.
Yeah.
Are we on the same page here?
I'd say so, yes.
Yeah, it's in my notes, I say it's about oscillation, moving in and out. I think another thing is that T.S. Eliot comment, we cannot bear very much reality. And I think we move in and out of the intensity of the grief sometimes, simply for relief, to retreat.
Yeah, and I think that idea that you don't deny the grief when actually you've had a day when you've had some joy and okayness.
Yeah.
Doesn't deny, but some people seem almost guilty to think that actually they went out with some friends and they had a good afternoon.
Yeah.
And this is a dreadfully wicked thing to have done.
That's right.
It isn't.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You got it.
It's the only time I've found it's helpful to actually have those stages, not as stages, but named. It is okay to feel any one of those things at any time.
Yep.
When someone says, I shouldn't be sad because he beat me up, that sort of thing. Naming those emotions that we do feel can be helpful to people, that they're not strange because they don't feel, or they do feel very strong feelings.
Yeah. I think what we can do, and I think the point being made earlier was we move in and out of the grief. over a period of time. And I think sometimes we retreat from it, immerse ourselves in work or a hobby. And that was often denied by the psychological model because it was called denial. Distraction helps us to learn to live within the new normal. Another point, grief can ambush us. So I'd encourage us to forget the idea of a timeline, and a word that really gets my hackles up, closure. Grief follows its own timeline. Will my grief come to an end? Some will say yes. Others speak of learning to live with their loss, and many others say the grief is always a part of their life. Something that the grief you learn to accommodate and allow to be a part of who you are. People will respond in different ways. I wonder, when you think about grief, I'll show you one that works for me. And I'm not saying this should work for you. Find it. No. I went to my bookshelf to look for something, and of course it's not there. I have a big nail that I was given. And if you can imagine the nail being banged into a tree and you can't extract it, but as the years go on, the tree grows around it and encompasses the nail. And I can never extract it, but it becomes almost a part of the life. And for me, that works. I'm not saying it should work for you. There's an image that worked for me. Wonder, are there any other images for you that have spoken to you in your own grief that you want to share? And remember, images are good because they're not necessarily right or wrong.
I had this image given to me about having a very, because of the grief, having a very prickly surface. So I imagine this sort of ball with prickles coming out of it. Mm-hmm. And it partly explains why people find it so difficult to talk to you or comfort you or be anywhere near you, because you send out these prickly prickles all over the place. Okay. And the grief is so paramount that you find that people just can't get anywhere near you.
Yeah. Thank you. It sounds like some real personal stuff behind that one. My other comment about the word closed off. Closure suggests that we shut off the loss to the extent that emotions over the loss aren't triggered in the future. But we never often get over the loss. It's, as I'm saying, it can become a part of us. As time passes, the intensity of the feelings lessen, or we might find ways to distract ourselves or try to bury our grief-related emotions, but we aren't going to successfully close them off. The question is, what do we choose to do with the deep emotions as they arise down the track? And their emergence isn't a sign that we haven't grieved well. They're a reminder that we can't control or predict grief. Sometimes it's taken me several years, in fact, a number of years, to finally say, hello, Alistair, you're grieving, mate. What do you need to do with it? Acknowledge it. Be with it. And that's happened to me on a number of occasions. Losses that took me a number of years to actually own and to begin to grieve for. Another idea, I better move on. Continuing bonds. And that challenges the idea of having to let go. That's a phrase you've heard. Silverman and others did some research, and they found it interesting that they were looking at widows in America, and they were finding the women were able to continue a relationship with their husband who had died, while at the same time beginning a new relationship. They're saying death does not end a relationship, it changes the relationship. And they coined the phrase, we continue a bond with the person who has died. And there was a very strong sense of thought, going back to Freud and others, that you had to actually sever that relationship if you were going to grieve healthily. When a person dies, they're dead and gone. But rather than the detachment from the dead, we continue a bond, we maintain it. It doesn't end the relationship, it changes it. And I would think that continuing bonds with the dead can be understood and experienced in different ways. And for me, it resonates with the Anglican belief in the communion of saints. You think about All Souls Day services. There's often that very strong sense of a continuing bond. I'll leave that thought there for you to think about. Right, I better move. I'm going to flip through this fairly quickly. If you want to look into more detail, you buy the book. But how might we experience grief? Well, a significant loss can affect every facet of our being. Physically, emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally, spiritually. And we won't necessarily experience all these facets, but being aware of them means we don't think we're falling out of our tree. It's about normalizing our experience. And I find much of the work I do as a pastor is to normalize, is for people to say, "Oi, I'm not being silly, am I?" No, you're actually being a very normal human being who's grieving. Experiencing grief in our body. Grief can be physically exhausting. Again, I'll give you a taste of one of the people I quote, Stephen Oliver. Stephen is a bishop in England. He was based in, I think, the East End of London. He was also a broadcaster. And his wife died, and he shares some of his grief story very powerfully. Some days my hand would shake so much that if I picked up a pen, I could barely write. My signature changed, which caused a problem or two with the bank. I remember standing at the top of the stairs and my legs wouldn't move. And when they did, I had the overwhelming feeling that I'd fall. I was no longer in control of my limbs. Even when talking, my mouth would feel somehow disconnected, and I found it difficult to form words. Brain and voice seemed no longer synchronized. I'd fall asleep at odd times. Then I'd wake in the small hours restlessly, only sleep again in brief snatches. I became accident prone. A cup would be dropped or a glass knocked over with disturbing regularity. I'll just put them up there for you. But those are common physical reactions. Doesn't mean you'd experience them all, but if you are, you know this is part of the chaos of grief. And then, just any comment on that? It's the same with the emotions. Again, please read what I've headed up, may include. Very important word. Now, I put sadness at the top because that's the emotion people most commonly associate with grief. But look what else can be there. It's a rather rich array, isn't it? One I would like to highlight is the anger, guilt, and regret. Our feelings can be a rather uncomfortable element of grief because we experience them so intensely, and there can be so many to have to cope with, and we can feel really dreadful about them. And I think often for Christians, guilt and anger can be ones that we struggle with. You know, good Christians don't get angry. You people now complete this sentence. God forgives you, forgive others. Yeah, I'm lip reading you. Forgive yourself. Go through to common reactions, the cognitive ones. You know, like Stephen mentioned, the memory loss, the absent-mindedness. I'm just stretching my back. Impaired thinking. Again, it's a rich array that can be there. And especially, for example, if they continue over extended period of time, it could be important to get some help or to consult about them. But if they occur just from time to time, especially in the initial stages, we're saying, hey, I'm not falling out of my tree. Another quote from Oliver. I found I could not concentrate on anything. I love to read, but I could only manage a couple of paragraphs before my mind went walkabout somewhere else. I wandered aimlessly about the house, unable to rest for more than a short time. I'd begin one task only to leave it unfinished and start another. Yet I had no real focus, no energy. People would leave a message on my phone asking me to ring them back, and they might just have asked me to run a marathon. In these earlier days, those who were most helpful were friends who didn't go, who went to the trouble of asking, but simply told me what I was to do. We're coming over for lunch and we're bringing a fish pie. All you got to do is open a bottle of wine. At least it got me moving. But it was by tapping into the energy of friends, because I simply had no energy that I could generate for myself. At this time, I depended on the good deal of other people taking the initiative.
Alistair?
Yes.
What was depersonalization?
The world, I can't actually connect with you. And things get distant out there. And it's almost as if I cannot, for me at times, it's meant I struggled to actually be in a personal dynamic because all the energy I had was being used for me to survive today. But sometimes it means for some people, things become out there at a distance. It's like there is an emotional, psychic, if I can use that word in its most general sense, distance between the two. Does that make sense? Withdrawal, overactivity, anger, disturbed eating patterns, crying, disturbed sleeping patterns. One that's often not named and people are afraid to talk about is changed sexual needs. They can totally diminish, or in fact, they can become accentuated. It's something that I talk a little bit about in the book because when I did some research on it, I found so little about that one. And then, of course, the question of spirituality. Again, a quote from C.S. Lewis that some of you have probably read before. Go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is in vain, and what do you find? a door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that silence, you may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. And I think, someone was sharing about that earlier on. Where is God in all this? God, do you really care? And that opens up the question of how do we relate to God in the midst of grief? How do we perceive God? And again, that's a question I've got to leave hanging in the air. But in the grief walk, I deliberately asked that in the second part of the book. Because for us as Christians, it's a question we often don't ask or wrestle with. But the gift of lament, the gift of the Psalms, the gift of Job in particular, are two areas I explore there. The other thing I want to name at this point is secondary losses and the loss of identity. Secondary losses doesn't mean a loss that's not important, not just in terms of impact, but in that they are secondary result of the primary loss. And each loss initiates its own grief. So what you have is you have your primary loss here, but then that loss causes a series of other losses. For example, a marriage or a long-standing relationship ends, but then you lose perhaps the house, you lose friends, you lose income, you lose identity, your relationship to your children change. Do you see? You get a series of subsequent losses. And in any loss, any substantial loss, you will find there are others that emerge further down the track that aren't acknowledged as losses. It's like the primary loss has that snowball effect. As one person put it, who's divorced, you divide the money, the house, the books, the chattels, and even the friends. And another major loss is the loss of identity. Who am I now? We is now I. I'm no longer a spouse or a partner. I think a lot of people, when they retire, speak to me about this. Who am I? I no longer have that identity in my work. I've lost also my colleagues, my friends, my pattern, but most of all, who am I? I'm thinking of Doug and Jane, who have a very loving relationship. And over the last couple of years, Doug's health has declined seriously. Jane is now, his wife, the primary caregiver. Their love for one another is obvious, but Jane is grieving the loss of her identity. I'm not sure I know anymore who I am. I feel as if I'm no longer Doug's wife. I've become his nurse. My role has changed. It seems as if I've lost the relationship we've had for these past 30 years. So in the last bit here, I want to ask the question.
Sorry,
Yep.
Alistair, can I cut in there?
Yes, please.
As well as losing your identity, you daily go through losing the person that you married.
Thank you.
So you're not just losing identity or change of position, but you're losing every day the person that you were with and that you first knew. And that happens on a daily basis.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just letting that comment stand there because I think what you've said is so important. I want to ask, what do I say? What do I do? Or what can I do? I'm wondering what's been like for you when someone has opened up to you about their loss, and what's it been like for you when they share their pain. And I sort of asked that question because it's likely that their sharing will trigger your own experiences of loss and grief. That's why I said at the beginning, don't treat tonight as an academic exercise, please. You learn, hopefully, and reflect on how you can journey with others, but that's tied in with what the losses mean for you. Because unless we're touched with our own experiences, unless we're been in touch and we are honest about our own experiences of loss, it can be threatening and scary when we encounter other people's. And the standard way that many of us respond is trying to fix them. And grief, in my experience, isn't something that can be fixed. I mentioned Walterstorff before, and this is probably one of the most helpful, it's a fairly extensive quote, but I found it so powerful for me, I wanted to share it with you. Again, it's quoted in the book. If you can't think of anything at all to say, just say, I can't think of anything to say. But I want you to know that we are with you in your grief. Or even just embrace, not even the best of words can take away the pain. What words can do is testify that there is more than pain on our journey on earth to a new day. Of those things that are more, the greatest is love. Express your love. But please, please, don't say it's not really so bad, because it is. If you think your task as comforter is to tell me that really, all things considered, it's not so bad, you don't sit with me in my grief, but place yourself off in the distance away from me. Over there, you're of no help. What I need to hear from you is that you recognize how painful it is. I need to hear from you that you are with me in my desperation. Come sit with me. Come sit beside me on my mourning bench. And later, when you ask me how I'm doing and I respond with a quick, thoughtless, fine or okay, just stop me sometime and ask, no, I mean really. That line, come sit with me on my mourning bench, has been quite powerful for me, because I realize sometimes that's all I have to offer. But that's, I think, reflecting on something I was talking about in the break with a couple of you. It's how I know God, Emmanuel, God with us. And perhaps that's the most valuable thing I can give to another. I can't fix you, I can't take your pain, but what I can do is somehow seek to be with you. There's no easy answer to that, but I often think of something that I think it was Henry Nouwen who said, that if you think about the people who have been most powerful in your life, they aren't the people who give you advice or solutions or cures, but they're the people who have chosen to simply journey with you in your pain. So my advice to people is, please don't recite the latest piece of wisdom gleaned from Facebook or your favorite verse of scripture. Listen and listen, and then could you please do some more listening? Here's a question, and I want to take a few minutes on it, because I have a feeling in this group tonight, there's some wisdom here I want to tap into. from your experience as a person who grieves and as one who's been with others who are grieving, what do and don'ts do you suggest? What should you not do? And what should you do? The do's and the don'ts, please, from your experience. Can you go for it?
Building on from what you were saying about sitting and staying, for me, a strong thought is from Jesus saying to his disciples, stay here, keep watch with me and pray.
Mm-hmm.
And as we sit, we don't have to pray out loud, but I think as Christians, one of the things that can help us more likely to do something that's helpful or to just stay in silence, which can be helpful, is actually not to forget that we can pray and seek the Holy Spirit's guidance.
Mm-hmm. When you've been grieving, what's one thing someone's done that you wish they'd never done?
You've got to move on.
Time will heal.
I hate the statement, God gives you nothing more than you can bear.
Mm-hmm.
I know just how you feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In answer to
cut
question. Sorry, Alistair. In answer to that question, you suggest, I think, don't forget how important touch is. I like how a phrase that caught my eye, and I've written it down, is words spoil anything that transcends them. It touches me when I'm grieving. It's not so much I want words. I want to feel that you're right there. And I've experienced the same when someone else is grieving and you are lacking in words. So you simply just squeeze a hand, give them a hug.
Listen for the language and the cues people are giving. In ministry, we may want to go into religious language, perhaps a little too quickly sometimes. But hear what the imagery and the language are using, and do they want to use that at the time? Just pick up, listen carefully, to what clues they're giving you, or clues and cues. I think one of the key things is don't problem solve or give neat logical answers. And remember that big question, why? Why? And remember when Jesus offered that question on the cross, he didn't get an answer straight away, did he? I think the why question, the great gift we can give to it is to testify to the fact it's been asked. And we can only leave it to hang there. We don't have an answer. Please don't rush in with a neat spiritual or logical answer. Allow the person to simply ask the question. Again, to quote Stephen Oliver, a friend said to Stephen, "There is no grief like your grief." He didn't mean that my grief was worse for me than anyone else. He did mean that my grief was special when put, he did not mean, that my grief was special when put alongside that of others. It was a kindly acknowledgement that my grief was unique to me, and that anyone who claimed to know what was going on inside me simply did not have the faintest clue. Yet from others came the unspoken but real assumption that I would get over it and that life would return to normal without their ever seeming to realize that for me, there was no normal any longer. A couple of other thoughts. Talk about the loss. I'm sorry your brother died. I loved your brother and I love you. Let me tell you a story about your brother. Will you tell me a story about your brother? Not to mention the person who's died or the loss the person has experienced denies the grieving person the freedom and the need to grieve. Otherwise, you're back into what we talked at the beginning, disenfranchisement. And the point's been made this evening by one of you, actions of care are all important. But numerous people have told me how questions like, how can I help you, or call me if there's anything I can do, are actually very unhelpful. As a widow put it to me, it placed her in the position of having to think what I had to ask people to do. And I didn't know what I needed or wanted. And the friends that were really helpful were those who simply turned up and said, I'm coming tomorrow and I'm going to take the dog for a walk, and here's a meal for you tonight. And you remember it's what Stephen says. It's those who brought the fish pie around and said, all you got to do is open a bottle from your cellar. But that is a dynamic that's been recounted to me so many times. Remember little things? A text, a message on Messenger, lighting a candle, little things. The gift we have to offer a person in grief is the gift of our presence. In a sense, what I've shared with you tonight, up to this point, is some of the quite practical stuff. And if I had another evening with you, where I would take you would be down to here, our search for meaning. And because the one thing that grief does and a serious loss does is it challenges the meaning of our lives. You know how often people say, this doesn't make sense? You see, meaning is what gives sense to our lives. And one of the people I work on is that classic work that was written by a man who had been through the concentration camps. And he asked the question, how do you find meaning in life? And the answer he came up with, one of the questions was, he said, you've got no control over what life throws at you. But there is one, this is Viktor Frankl, sorry, the one piece of power we always have and that no one can take from us is our ability to choose how we respond to what happens to us. And that's something that I try to unpack later in the book. There's that, to give you a teaser, who are you, said the caterpillar. And Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning. but I think I must have changed several times since then. It's the challenge to meaning that can happen when we are experiencing profound grief. I'm going to stop right there, because if I carry on, I go into another dynamic, and we got to stop in exactly 4 minutes. What I want to do is flip along, and Jan said she would circulate this. If you want to get hold of the grief walk, you can go to Amazon, go to the publisher, or email me. The Amazon and the publisher will give you electronic versions or hard copy, or I can sell you a hard copy, and the copies are there. What there is also free and available is a study guide that's on the publisher's website, and that's on a PDF, and you can download it. And I know a number of clergy have used that in their parishes in study groups alongside the book. Jan, I shall get rid of this.
Well, congratulations, Alistair. We had a practice with the technology yesterday, and you did it perfectly. Well done.
That's thanks to Deborah Broom.
I don't know that I have sufficient words, because I'm going to be processing what you've said for a long time, over re-examining my own grief, let alone the experiences I've had in sharing others' journeys. But thank you for tonight. It's opened a whole pile of things with us. I'm going to read the book again in more detail and with more attention, and with a bit more wisdom, maybe. Thank you to everybody else who's also shared in tonight. And on behalf of those who will catch up later, thank you as well.
And thanks for some of the wisdom that was shared tonight. There's a couple of points there I stopped and I thought, I need to ponder that. So thank you for some of the comments shared tonight.
I know it sounds a bit like Pentecost, but if you unmuted and we made a terrible noise, would you like to say the grace together?
Anglican.
Oh no, can't help myself. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all evermore. Amen.
Amen.